Hello and welcome to Events Dear Boy, the podcast for anyone involved in business events. If you're a conference producer, corporate event organizer, or events agency, then we're here for you. We want to share the highs and the lows, the best practices, and the horror stories. You can expect ideas and inspiration, and maybe some laughs too.
And if you're a speaker at these events, then we're also here for you. We'll be talking about how you do it, what makes speakers nervous, and how it feels when it all goes brilliantly or terribly.
My name is Catherine McNamara and I'm the marketing lead at the talent agency Pomona Partners and someone who has organised many business events in my working life. Alongside me is Pomona Partners founder and veteran of 1,000 speaking gigs, Tom Cheesewright.
Each episode, we're going to be joined by a guest from the business events space, either an event organiser or a speaker. We'll ask them to share their experiences, both good and bad, and their tips for other people in their positions. We're now in season 2, so there are plenty of episodes featuring incredible guests for you to go back and listen to or watch if you haven't seen or heard them already. Plus a little wrap up where Catherine and I talk about what we've learned and what has made us laugh from season 1. Not quite a blooper reel, although we'll have to do one of those at some point.
And this week, I'm delighted to say that we're joined by Katie Treggiden. Katie, welcome. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for that perfect pronunciation of my surname. I'm not sure that's ever happened first time before.
Oh, well, do you know what? I practice surnames. This could be part of the blooper reel or the unblooper reel where before we start recording, sometimes I highlight within the script and say, Tom, is this how you say it? And like phonetically spell it. Other times not, so.
And sometimes she does, and it turns out I've been saying it wrong for 15 years. So, you know.
That happened to me recently with somebody I know really well. I've like really old friends, and I had her on a panel and I was like, can I just double check that this is how you say your name? And she was like, no, it's really not.
Oh, that's the journalist in me. We always had to check.
Yeah.
Always had to check. It's just not worth your salt if you get kind of the basics wrong, is it?
No.
But Katie, what is your launching in? What's your area of expertise? If you can just kind of give us a little bit of an overview.
So firstly, I'm really uncomfortable with the word expertise. I think the point at which I define myself as an expert, it's time for me to go home. I think I am more interested in being on a journey of learning and discovery and curiosity and bringing people on that journey with me. So the things I do, the things I'm on that journey with, I would say firstly is storytelling. So I'm, alongside being a keynote speaker, also an author, journalist and podcaster myself. And I think what I am good at is taking complex subjects and making them understandable, accessible, and kind of infusing them with energy and passion so that people become interested in them. And the things I tell stories about are craft design and sustainability. So I did a master's a few years ago and set myself the question, can craft save the world? And that is the area I've been exploring ever since. And so I'm kind of super interested in understanding the ways in which making with our hands, using natural materials, all those sorts of things can lead us towards a circular economy.
I love that idea that instead of being an area of expertise, it's kind of the locus of your curiosity. You know, it's about what things am I learning about rather than what things am I expert in. And if it wasn't for the fact that describing people as expert talent is such a useful shorthand when we're trying to tell people what our people do, I think we talk about instead about their locus of curiosity.
Yeah, it probably doesn't rank quite as high on an SEO search.
Probably not, no, but it's beautiful. I like it. Tell us about your journey to becoming a speaker, because that's you've got that sort of group of interests, and there's a real interesting coherence there between that design background, that journalism background, and that deep interest and passion for sustainability. How did it end up putting you on stage and talking to people in that sense?
I mean, I think I've been told that I talk too much since the moment I started talking. So in some ways, it was inevitable. I have a whole career in advertising before this career, so I knew I would have to do presentations. So I got a part-time job at university, which involved presenting to 450 17-year-olds. And that got me over my fear of the stage at a very young age. But then I guess I started work as a craft and design journalist in 2010. And people just started asking me, it was one of those things that sort of happened very naturally. Originally to chair panel events, which is kind of where I started. And I think that's a very common thing for a journalist to do. It's a very similar skill set. It's kind of asking questions and weaving together a narrative, albeit doing it live and in front of an audience rather than at home and on your computer. But then I started writing books. And I think as a result of the books, people started asking me to give keynotes, which is the thing that I love to do most.
I think it can't have been that long after 2010 that you and I first worked together. It was, I don't know, 2014 maybe, something like that. Well,
Yeah.
I have a memory of doing a panel debate in a basement of a designer carpet shop or something.
Yeah, it was the basement of a company that's now called Tucket, who I still work with.
Brilliant.
And yeah, it was a lot of fun. They were one of my very, very earliest clients. And I still work with them. I still put together those panel events. They now have a nicer showroom with actual natural daylight, which is lovely.
So what kind of events are do you gravitate towards? Do people book you for, Katie?
I mean, I think kind of design fairs all over the world, trade shows, sort of the craft industry, but increasingly conferences. So I did the closing keynote at the Vancouver Zero Waste Conference in Canada, which was incredible. And it was so fun because you could imagine you've got everybody there from panels of the sort of council workers who are in charge of municipal waste right through to a spoken word poetry performance. Is absolutely one of the most fun conferences I've ever spoken at. And increasingly companies ask me to come in for their sustainability weeks. So often companies will put together a sort of week of events, usually around Earth Day in April, and ask me to come in to speak to senior leadership teams, creative teams, that sort of thing. So yeah, it varies, but it's usually a situation where I get to be the inspiring bit. There's kind of a panel event that's covered off the stuff that's got to be covered off. There's a poet or something who's kind of doing that creative bit, and I get to come in and tell a story, which is what I love to do most.
I get this sense that the conversation inside corporates about sustainability has changed quite radically in the last 5 years. And I'm in many ways, I'm quite optimistic about it. I think there's clearly still an awful lot of sort of corporate bad behavior here and there, but it feels like there is and this isn't about altruism. It feels like there is a much tighter alignment between sustainability goals and business goals than there was 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Like they've just recognized that it is good business, not that it's not about, certainly for the good companies, it's not about greenwashing anymore. It's about, this is fundamentally about the protection of our supply chain and our ability to still be here in 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think very much it used to fall under CSR. It was a nice to have that may or may not happen with tiny budgets that, some poor soul was tasked with organizing on top of their day job. Whereas I think now companies are starting to understand that that is the way the world is moving. And if they want to survive, they need to get on board. I think more and more there's also an understanding that employees and customers both want to engage with companies whose values align with their own. And so I think it's those sort of values driven decisions have again moved from something that seemed quite philanthropic and perhaps the slightly weirder companies were doing to something that's very mainstream. And that's not just a sense of these are three words that all mean the same thing that we've stuck on our website under the heading values. It's much more of a sense of genuine introspection. What do we care about? What do our employees care about? What do our customers care about? And more that is involving environmentalism. And what I love about environmentalism is it's so intersectional. You can't do environmentalism without looking at social justice, without looking at, kind of equity and all of those sorts of things. And I think people are starting to understand that. It's getting there.
Yeah, I was in a meeting with the leadership team of a client just yesterday, actually, and it wasn't the marketing person who's boasting about their sustainability prowess. It was the MD. And
Yeah,
nice.
nice.
I think that's a big shift.
Yes, yeah, and I chaired a panel event for a company during Clerkenwell Design Week, and it was the third generation CEO who'd invested a lot of time, effort, and risk into a collaboration because he genuinely wanted to leave a legacy and to change the direction of this generation's old family business. And when you see that sort of thing, where it's really runs from the top to the bottom of the company, I think that starts to get really exciting, because that's when real change can happen.
Yeah.
I think that's that word legacy, and that kind of anchoring a lot of your decisions around, you know, looking after your employees as well, knowing that you're taking something and you're leaving it at a better place than you found it. That has been, it feels like I'm having that conversation more and more often, even with kind of previous podcast guests, Tom. We've gone into that. Really interestingly, I was sitting in on a round table that took place at an event a couple of months back, and it was a technology round table looking at collaboration between private sector and public sector, and they were talking about smart cities and smart places and how the definition of smart has changed over the last 5-10 years, and actually it's now interchangeable for sustainability, that role of technology and all these things working together, and again that legacy piece coming into it. So
it's not
really
just about how much
interesting.
technology can we sell to the public sector this
Correct.
time.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
And I think there's also a sense of kind of nature informed decision making. So there's this beautiful idea of representing nature on your board of directors, and kind of having, I know a furniture company that has an oak tree on their board of directors, and someone comes to represent that oak tree's long-term interests and the interests of the forest. And I think those
That's
sort of things are
incredible.
really interesting as well.
I think that sort of speaks to it though, but you know, what do you love about speaking? I get there's a definite sense of sort of inspiration there.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, the adrenaline buzz is like nothing else. I love that sort of feeling a bit sick for days beforehand, and then the moment you get up on stage, it's just like nothing else. So there's definitely some just joy in standing up on a stage in front of a lot of people. But I think it's about connecting with people. It's about seeing things land, seeing the moment where somebody thinks slightly differently about something than they thought about it before, and really inspiring action, inspiring change. So, you know, there's no point doing this for me if everybody just has a nice time and then goes home and carries on exactly as they were before. I want to prove that craft can change the world, and I want to play a part in that happening. So I think it's that kind of, the buzz of being up there, the connection with other humans, and just seeing light bulbs go off in their brains, and then kind of understanding what the impact of that is afterwards.
It's funny, I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but it took me a little while to come to terms with the fact that as a speaker that it was okay to enjoy the fact that I enjoyed performing.
Yeah.
It feels sort of quite un-British in some ways, but actually I like being up there. I like being in the lights. I like being on stage.
It's so, and equally, it took me a little while to come to terms with the fact that it's also okay to be nervous.
Yeah.
Like, I will, if I'm not feeling a little bit sick before a big gig, I'm probably not taking it seriously enough. And again, in the same way that I don't ever want to be an expert, I don't ever want to not be nervous, because I think it's excitement, it's nerves, it's all the same thing, but it shows you care. And I think that is, because people will often say to me, you know, like, don't you get nervous? And I'm like, yeah, I do. I get really nervous, but I love it. And so, I think both of those things, people don't, they sort of, it's not cool to admit how much fun you have up there. And it's also, people don't believe that you still get nervous when they see how confident you are when you actually get up there. So I think both of those things.
And if you were to spill the tea on your worst speaking experience, whether that's been on stage or prep or whatever that might look like, what would you tell us?
I think there's two I can think of. One was one of these twin track conferences where at each juncture people have to decide which talk they're going to go to. And it was a relatively small conference. There were probably about 100 people there. So you sort of think there's going to be about 50 people in each room. It's a talk for designer makers, and I'm talking about how to be sustainable. And the other talk I'm up against is talking about how to make more money.
I see where this is going.
You know where this is going. 5 people, 5 brave souls came to my presentation that I had fully prepared to stand on a stage and deliver, right? But it was actually incredible, because we sat on some chairs in a circle and had the most beautiful conversation. And I got to really connect with those 5 people and talk to them about the fact that making being sustainable and making money are not mutually exclusive. In fact, I would argue the more aligned you are with your values, the more successful business you're going to build. Sadly, only 5 people got to hear that message, but it was humbling. I'm not going to lie, watching 95 people walk in a different direction. So yeah, I think, and it's difficult because you don't want to put very similar talks up against each other, because then people are forced to choose, right? And I kind of understand why the conference organizers did it. The other one, I had a very badly twisted ankle. I probably should have been on crutches, but refused to be on crutches. And I arrived at the venue and nobody had told me where I needed to go. Nobody was there to meet me. I literally arrived at this enormous conference center and I'm phoning people and texting people and just absolutely nothing. I eventually managed to find my way to the space to realize that the conference organizers hadn't advertised my session at all, so nobody knew it was happening. I was doing 2 sessions, one of which they'd advertised as something else entirely, so everybody who turned up was expecting something different, and the other one just hadn't been advertised, so nobody showed up. And it was just one of those examples of like, I am not a diva, but it's like, why am I here? What am I? It was a frustrating experience because I'd sort of traveled up to London on my very twisted ankle and then, wandered all over this exhibition center in vast amounts of pain, trying to figure out where I was supposed to be. And it was just bad communications and organization. But just, quite frustrating.
It does baffle me sometimes. You've been paid potentially quite a lot of money to come and do something. And you arrive, I arrived at one where I arrived the night before I was due to speak, and I was doing the closing keynote the following day. But I arrived during the sort of gala dinner that was already going on, which meant that everyone who was organising was in the dinner. And the hotel desk had no record of my booking there. It was in the middle of nowhere. Couldn't get hold of anybody on the phone. The hotel weren't particularly helpful, and it was a very, 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 very large hotel. And I ended up just sort of wandering the halls of this hotel, trying to find someone to give me a pass or a hotel room key or something about 10 o'clock at night.
Yeah, and it's just the sort of thing that, regardless of whether that's an okay way to treat another human being, it just doesn't set you up for success. Like, you're not going to arrive at your talk and do your best performance if that's been the way into it, right?
It's I guess we'll come back to that, because one of the questions is about tips for event organisers. I think we've given them one there. What tips would you give to other speakers now that you've done a lot of speaking in the last sort of 10, 12 years, 14 years really? Like, what tips would you give to other speakers, particularly the ones who are maybe sort of earlier in their speaking career?
I mean, I think firstly, feel free to ignore all of the following, because I think everybody has their own style and you'll learn what works for you and what doesn't. And
you're not an expert, are you? So it doesn't matter.
Not an expert. But I think part of this is trying on lots of ways of doing things and working out what works for you, and what works for me might not work for somebody else. I personally prepare. I don't think, I am not one of these people who can wing it and turn up. I mean, I can, as long as I've done my prep. So I think what's quite interesting is I always ask to see questions before a podcast interview so I can prepare. Often when you actually get there, someone will ask you a completely different set of questions, but it doesn't matter because I've done my prep. So interestingly, I think and there's this sort of sense of, I was talking to someone, she and I both spoke at the Design Council's festival, Design for Planet Festival. And we were talking about the fact we both rehearse our speeches. And he was like, I'm so glad I'm not the only one. And I was like, I mean, are there people who don't? So I will completely over prepare to the point at which I know something backwards, inside out, back to front. And then you have to let go of all that. Then you have to just turn up. And I think I have done speeches where I have written a talk and memorized it and delivered it verbatim, and I don't think that's the best way for me, because I think it will always sound like you are reading lines, even though they're your lines and you've written them and you're not reading. It always sounds a little bit unnatural. So I think you almost need to kind of learn that speech by heart and then forget it, and then turn up and say whatever comes to you in the moment, which feels super high risk, particularly when it's a long talk, but having some sort of visual prompt that keeps you to, you know, where you're supposed to be in the talk, that you press the next button on the slide and it's like, oh, it's that image. Okay. You know, so I think it's sort of completely over preparing, but then letting go of all the props and crutches and preparation, and trusting yourself to be able to say something interesting in the moment.
I think you're so right with that, and it fits very well with the way I do things. Organised. We've mentioned before on the podcast that people are always surprised when I deliver my slides to them on time.
Yeah.
2 weeks before, and it's because I'm doing exactly that process. I've done the research. I've written it. Now I've got 2 weeks, I can let it go. I can let it sort of ruminate around in my head.
Yeah.
I can wake up having fresh thoughts about it. And then when I get to the conference, I've got, ideally minimum a couple of hours, ideally a day, to listen to what's going on and then refresh everything that I've written down and all of those prompts with fresh information that can be linked back into it.
And especially when you're doing a closing keynote, that's so important that you don't just stand up and deliver a talk. You've got to be able to, and again, the conference I did in Vancouver, I was sat in the front row of the whole conference because I was delivering the closing keynote, and everyone's like, wow, you're keen. I can't believe you're here for the whole 2 days. It's like, how am I going to deliver a closing keynote if I'm not at the front paying attention, making, so that, and half of that stuff might not make it into your talk, but you've got to make sure it's reflective of those 2 days and wraps them up nicely. But equally, I wouldn't turn up having prepared nothing and just rely on what's happening in those 2 days. It's got to land in fertile soil, I think.
It's one of my favourite bits of hosting, actually, is having to do that on your feet thinking at the end, where you're drawing together all the threads. So you've been scribbling notes throughout the day, but then you've got your sort of 5-10 minute closer at the end, and you're just drawing, like in your head, you're putting like linking themes, creating little narratives, like to draw it all together for people. I really enjoy that bit.
Yeah, it's so much fun. And it is, that's where that adrenaline comes in, I think, because it's that element of risk, right? It's that kind of balance between, I've done all the prep, I've done everything I possibly can, but in this moment, I'm not sure what's going to come out of my mouth.
And what about advice for organisers? So obviously, sore ankle gait is a really good case in point.
Yeah. And I think it's so difficult, isn't it? Because when you're running an event, you've got 17,000 things to think about. But I think the difference between that event where I felt abandoned is probably the right word, and the Vancouver event where I felt so well looked after, so taken care of. And, it's silly things like they had hair and makeup. And it's not the hair and makeup in and of itself. My hair is not that complicated. I don't usually wear makeup, but it's just the fact that they've thought about that. They're taking care of you. And I think that's how you get people to do their best work. This stuff is all reciprocal and collaborative. And I think the more you can make speakers feel loved and cared for and part of the team, not just, quote unquote talent, the sort of asset that's been paid for, put on a stage and booted off again, the more that is reciprocated, and it kind of feels kind of spacious and juicy and gracious and lovely. And then I think the other thing is everybody, before they go on stage, have a little thing they need to do. And I think you have to let speakers do whatever it is they need to do. Like, some people need to pace, some people need to sit in a quiet corner, some people need to repeat their kind of ideas over and over. And I think just giving folks a little bit of space before they go on stage to do, some people have little rituals they like to do, like just giving people space to get in the zone so that when they walk on stage, they're there. They're not coming off the back of a conversation they've just had with you backstage. I think those would be my 2 top tips.
Absolutely. Brilliant.
Fantastic. And I think that's a really great place to wrap up today's episode. So thank you so much for coming on, Katie. That's been brilliant.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Excellent. And thank you to everybody for listening and watching. We hope you enjoyed this. And if you did, please leave a review, like and subscribe. And most importantly, share this podcast with your colleagues and peers, whether they are fellow speakers or event organisers. And we'll be back soon with another episode. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.